Today we are picking up with a Western-dominated world and how that is going to affect Africa. So we get this new imperialism that's going to dominate Africa. And imperialism is where you are dominated by one country. It takes over your government, it takes over your money system, it takes over your religion and language, all that kind of stuff. So imperialism is going to start in the 1800s in Africa. And the Industrial Revolution is going to allow European countries to come in to dominate the Africans because they had better weapons and better technology, better medicine, all kinds of stuff. Now, the motives of new imperialism or this imperialistic movement, first off, it's kind of a nationalist thing. Every country wanted its own country to be the best in the world, and so nationalism is going to serve an important role in why this happens. If one country moved into Africa, the rest are going to follow, because what if somebody else found something that's going to make them richer or more powerful, or have more population, or it's a medicine of some sort or something. So if one country moves into an area, the rest are going to be following in. Another motive behind it is sort of like a humanitarian feel for it, that they felt sorry for the Africans, and so this was a way to help them. You wanted to change their culture because obviously they just don't know any better. And so the Europeans tend to treat the Africans like children and rather ignore the fact that these were cultures that were just as good as European cultures, but just had not progressed as quickly as European cultures had. Another motive behind this is social Darwinism, the survival of the fittest idea, that if you're meant to survive, you will. And so Europeans tended to think that they were better than the Africans and that they must dominate them. It's like a natural thing that you have to do it. Another motive behind it is that, well, you know what? We had the weapons and we had the manpower to dominate, so why the heck don't we? The Industrial Revolution is going to help with that. The Africans just couldn't defend themselves against machine guns and the vaccines and the steamships that the Europeans had. They tried to resist, but they just weren't strong enough in order to really make an impact or to really get rid of the Europeans for any sense of time. Now, there's several different forms of imperial control, and each country is going to treat its area or its colony differently. And so the first form is a colony, and typically in a colony you would send over governors and officials and an army with soldiers, and you would rule over the area and you make up the laws and the punishments. And basically the whole idea behind this is that you want to transform this area of Africa into sort of like a mirror reflection of your home country. So if you were Germany and you took over a part of Africa, you would have them speak German, they would follow the German religion, they'd have German money. So it's like they're a mirror reflection of their parent country. The second form of imperial control is called a protectorate. And a protectorate is where you leave the local rulers in place, but they still had to accept the advice of the Europeans on things like trade and laws and that kind of stuff. The nice thing about a protectorate is that it does cost less for the Europeans to run, and so sometimes they decided to do that. If they had a fairly malleable, or ones that you could influence really well, ruler in place, like if you just gave them more money, they'd do what you want, sort of thing, then you'd probably keep them in place, because heck, you don't have to send somebody there then, because they'll take care of it. And all you have to do is grease their pockets a little bit and they'll be fine. So sometimes they decided to do that. The third form is called a sphere of influence, and a sphere of influence meant that the Europeans could trade with or invest in a certain area however they wanted, but for the most part that area is going to be in control of itself. So it's just an area that they have an influence on more so than other countries, sort of thing. So eventually what's happening is we're going to see the partitioning of Africa, and a partition is like a wall. If you think like an office building, how in the offices they have their little cubicles. Well, a cubicle is like a partition. So if you think they divide up the whole floor of the office building, well, that's what they do with Africa. They divide it up into their own little sections. And so the Europeans, like I said, were not very familiar with Africa. They didn't know a whole lot about it. In fact, they called it the Dark Continent. Not because of the race of the people living there, but because it was so unknown. It's kind of like how the Dark Ages are called the Dark Ages, because there's so little known about that time. So that's why it's called the Dark Continent. Now, they knew the outskirts because they'd seen it as they were shipping and going around Africa, but disease and other hardships are not going to allow for a whole lot of exploration into the deeper part of Africa. Now, like I said, the Industrial Revolution is going to change all that. The Europeans were very fascinated by the geography of Africa because, let's face it, it's got a ton of different things going on. They got a desert, they got savanna area, they've got jungle, they've got mountains. It's just crazy that they have so much on one continent. But they didn't understand the people that they encountered. They totally didn't understand the cultures that they were coming across, like the way they were thinking or how they did their business and that kind of stuff. The Europeans, as they start going into Africa, are going to try to build schools, and they'll try to put together clinics to try and educate the Africans in the European way of life, because why bother learning the African way of life? Just have them learn ours, kind of thing. And they are going to urge them to reject their own traditions and to become more modernized. And in some ways they're successful, and in some ways they're not successful. So the Europeans decide to meet together and decide what they're going to do with Africa so that they're all on the same page. And they're going to set up the guidelines in 1884. But a nation could only claim a part of Africa if they were going to set up a government to control it. So there was not going to be a sphere of influence. You would still you could have a protectorate or you could have a colony, but you can't have anything else. They also decided that they would have free trade in the Congo and the Niger rivers so that there wouldn't be a whole mess of problems coming from that as European nations started to fight each other. So they're going to draw up the boundaries and they're going to set up the frontiers of Africa. And 20 years later, almost all of Africa is dominated. Now, France is going to take most of the land, but Britain is going to occupy the heavily populated areas that tended to have a lot of rich resources. So France might have gotten the bigger chunk, but Britain got the best, sort of thing. So, 1910, Britain is going to set up South African government with all white government officials, which is going to later lead to major segregation, and we'll talk about how that influences South Africa later on in the unit. But because of this partitioning, it's going to change Africans forever, because for the most part, they didn't pay attention to tribal things, and so tribes will be split into 2 or 3 different countries or colonies. They didn't pay attention to language, they didn't pay attention to rivalries, anything like that. They didn't care. It honestly did not matter to the Europeans whatsoever. And so the Africans are going to be changed by this forever, and it's still affecting them today. Some thought it's going to be for the better, and others are going to fight against it, but they don't have the manpower, they don't have the technology that the Africans do, and so it is going to take a while to get rid of these colonies, but it does eventually happen.